and welcome to the very first 24 Site video podcast. I'm Tom Lobianco, national politics reporter at 24 Site, and we are joined today by two of the leaders of Republican voters against Trump. Gunnar Raymer is the political director, and John Conway. Gunnar, John, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having us.
So, I just realized, to me, as an elder millennial, I felt like Republican voters against Trump is still a new thing. And I guess I'm one of those people that's still like trapped in 2016 or 2020, as it were. And you've been doing this for a while now. And I mean, the field research that you're coming back with is pretty remarkable. When you hear from double Trump voters who are saying, we can't go with this guy again. I mean, what are some of the consistent themes that you're hearing when you get these voter testimonials coming in?
Sure. So I think that Republican voters against Trump, which was a campaign back in 2020, in 2022, we went after Trump's backed candidates like Kari Lake in Arizona with Republican voters against Lake. In Pennsylvania, we went with our campaign, Republican voters against Mastriano. So I think that going forward with our 2024 campaign, Republican voters against Trump, what makes this campaign unique is that we are elevating, highlighting, emphasizing the voices of former Trump supporters. And I think when you are dealing with the 2016, but they didn't vote for Trump in 2020 voter, that they may have supported him in 2016 because they wanted a businessman, an outsider. We hear it in focus groups all the time, and they didn't like Hillary Clinton. But when you are talking to a 2016 Trump 2020 voter, I think what concerns them the most is both backward looking and forward looking, right? When they are backward looking, it's this idea of January 6th that struck a chord in these traditional Republicans, these conservatives who look at what happened and think it's the exact opposite of what anybody who supports the Constitution would want. But I think an important messaging strategy that we have is that it is forward-looking. It's this idea of trumping a dictator on day one, of terminating the Constitution, of retribution and revenge against any of his political enemies that very much bothers them. And I will say that we have some of our supporters who make the affirmative case that they will be supporting Joe Biden in 2024. Some of them may leave the top of the ticket blank or go third party, but we are all about maintaining and building on the anti-Trump coalition that propelled Joe Biden to victory in 2020.
Yeah, I think, Tom, too, there's an underrated aspect of how we're able to find these two-time Trump voters who aren't going to vote for him in 2024. And it's after November of 2020, voters saw January 6th after they had already voted for Donald Trump. They saw him face 88 criminal charges after they voted for him in November of 2020. So when we're thinking about finding two-time Trump voters who aren't going to do it again, we need to focus on things that have happened after they've already made an affirmative choice to vote for Donald Trump in 2020. And that's why we see time and time again these two-time Trump voters say, look, I voted for him reluctantly in 16, I voted for him reluctantly in 2020, and then I saw January 6th and I decided I'm out. I can't support this guy ever again. So when we're thinking about finding these voters, right, there's two types of swing voters that we're looking at this cycle. One is the double doubter, somebody who has negative opinions on both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And as you said, we ran this campaign in 2020. We found thousands of 2016 Trump voters and 2020 Biden voters, right? So they voted for both candidates before. They might have a negative opinion on both. What we can do is we can remind them why they couldn't support Donald Trump in 2020. That can be very powerful, reminding them of things that they didn't like in the first administration, reminding them why in November of 2020 they couldn't vote for Donald Trump then and they can't vote for him now, right? But we also, when we're looking at these two-time Trump voters, we have to find new information that is something that they could never have voted this guy has lost his mind since the last time they voted for Donald Trump can be very powerful.
Yeah, boy, tell me about it. I don't want to fall too far down the rabbit hole here, but I remember, what was it? One of those counter programming things where he refused to do the Republican debate. And just at random, he brought up how it was like the biggest audience he'd seen since Oprah interviewed Michael Jackson. I was like, what year is it? Like, I don't know. These blips.
Exactly. Donald Trump will blow himself up on the campaign time and time again. He creates this rift between swing voters and himself. So while he was an incredibly powerful primary candidate, we've seen in our research and the focus groups and with our campaign that he's alienating swing voters when he opens his rallies with January 6th rioters in prison singing the national anthem. That's disgusting for swing voters. It creates a rift with swing voters. So Donald Trump has really become more extreme, and our voters, especially these two-time Trump voters that we're finding for our campaign, have internalized the fact that this is a more dangerous person. This is a more extreme person. This is a crazy person. And there's no way that they can support him in 2024.
And this is a thing that we've noticed, and we saw it last cycle play out in 2022, and we see it again, that typically, at least in modern politics, to win a Republican primary, you had to run to the right on certain issues, right? Go against Obamacare, go against immigration. But what these candidates have had to do, and what Trump himself does naturally, because that's where his political instincts lead him, is run not just to the right, but Trumpward. And if there's one thing that we've learned after 2018, after 2020 with Trump's campaign himself, and in 2022, when Republicans lost a lot of winnable races in places like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, is that it is one thing these days to win a Republican primary, and it is another to win a general election. And that traditional pivot that Republicans have tried to make in previous cycles just does not work the same, because these swing voters are absolutely repulsed by Donald Trump and his brand of politics.
I think it's fascinating. I guess this kind of gets to the disconnect that, often we have. We're here in DC. I'm in suburban DC. We quite literally are in the political bubble, and it's almost like, unless we're covering another House January 6th hearing, we don't write about January 6th in the press, and that is I would argue is a failing of us in the political press. But I find it interesting, and this is what you're seeing from these testimonials, is how indelibly marked that attack.
I think that a lot in DC have this cynical view of, they say democracy is not on the ballot, right? That the average voter out there doesn't care about our democracy. Maybe that's the case with the average voter, but when you are talking to a swing voter, a traditional Republican, conservative, Reagan-esque, they're most likely to be college-educated suburban voters. Do they care about our democracy? Absolutely. That is a through line in our testimonials, that something like January 6th disgusted them and is a main reason for why they can't support Trump in 24, even if they have voted for him twice, in 2016 and 2020, right? That this may not be significant, a significant amount of voters in terms of the overall electorate, but they are significant in the pivotal role they play in deciding who's going to become the next president of the United States.
So I think we've got some of the testimonials queued up. Can we let's hear from them? Let's hear from the voters themselves.
I'm a former Trump voter. I live in Wisconsin. During the 2020 campaign, it seemed like more and more concerns were raised that caused me to begin to question whether I could vote for Donald Trump. His insistence that the election was rigged, that he hadn't lost. I just became very discouraged and distressed. I think my greatest concerns related to, again, in a second term, would be his desire to remove anyone who disagrees with him from any position of power or influence.
What scares me the most about a second Donald Trump term is that we're basically heading in the direction of a dictatorship. Hi, I'm Scott. I am from North Carolina, and I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. With respect to the upcoming elections in 2024, I will never see myself voting for Donald Trump. I voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because I thought he represented a change in the direction of what the country was going. And I thought that he might have an opportunity to bring about change. But shortly after election, actually during the election, I began to sour on Trump, but I wasn't happy with my alternative choices. I don't believe Donald Trump should ever be elected again because the way he went about trying to overturn the election.
I grew up in Iowa in a family of Republicans, and I voted for Trump in 2016 and will not vote for him in 2024. And I believe if Donald Trump gets a second term, that he might do the same thing that Xi Jinping has done in China and that Vladimir Putin has done in Russia, and set himself up as an emperor. And America's Constitution doesn't have room for emperors.
Wow. I was listening to these when you sent them over, and it reminded me, we end on Iowa here. It reminded me a lot of what the conservatives were doing in the Republican primary, the Club for Growth, and a lot of the folks who were backing that effort in Iowa, because it's not personal attacks. It's not even flashy. It's just very bare bones, straightforward. This is what's deeply concerning to us. And I remember, especially last summer, they saw that moving numbers. Tell me a little bit about your thinking on going this route, as opposed to for instance, one of the other big Never Trump groups, the Lincoln Project, which tends to go the flashier route.
Yeah, when we were building this campaign in 2019 and 2020 to defeat Donald Trump, we did a ton of focus group research to try and figure out what was going to make these Trump skeptical voters vote against him in that election. And as you saw in some of these videos, when people are talking about the Republican identity, the woman in Iowa was talking about growing up in a family of Republicans, right? We have to remember that these are still Republican voters, and voting is incredibly tribal in the United States. So when we were showing them flashy political ads that were running really hard at Donald Trump, they would naturally recoil and start to be defensive because they felt like their Republican identity was being attacked, right? And what we found is when we showed them videos of just everyday people, everyday Republicans who could speak to the same identity that our target audience was, those guards went down. They were more receptive to the message. They said, this is somebody who I identify with, right? This is somebody who shares my voting characteristics. Maybe they live in my state. They've also never voted for a Democrat before. They have also been a lifelong Republican before. And they're sharing my same concerns about Donald Trump, and they're not going to vote for him in 2020, or in this case in 2024. And that creates that permission structure for voters to say, if that person can do it, I can do it too. Because just like voting is tribal and it makes people recoil when they see these flashy attack ads attacking their candidate, and they kind of reflexively want to defend their party and their tribe. When you create a new tribe of people that all share both the same political identity and kind of voting history, as well as that they're all going to be these Republican voters against Trump, it gives everybody that push forward away from Donald Trump to say, look, I'm a Republican voter against Trump. Everybody in this campaign that I'm a part of or that I'm seeing is a Republican voter against Trump. Mike Pence not endorsing Donald Trump is very important, right? He's a Republican voter against Trump. So we're creating these permission structures to tell other voters that it's okay to be a Republican. It's okay to have voted for Donald Trump before, but we're going to vote against him in 2024 because our democracy is far more important than the policy disagreements that they have with Joe Biden.
That's the thing, Tom, that's so important, right? That people in DC are obsessed. It's all about messaging. But what we landed on is that it is not only about messaging, but it's about the messenger. And that's exactly who these voters who we are highlighting in these testimonial campaigns are, right? That I always like to say that the swing voter is the most thoughtful voter in politics. When you do focus groups with them, the one thing that you certainly take notice of how deeply they are concerned about their vote choice, how deeply they are thinking about everything. And I think it gives them this subtle reminder of, hey, you know what? There's someone out there who reminds them of themselves, who is also going through this and saying, you know what? I may have loved voting for Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George Bush, and John McCain and Mitt Romney, but this Trump guy I just can't get behind. But again, as John said, that is just that little extra push that really we have found gets them over the line.
It reminds me, especially earlier in my career when I was starting out as a political reporter, I'd go out there and talk with voters around Maryland and in Indiana and in various races. And, as a relative novice back then, I would ask check the box questions like, okay, you're a Democrat. All right. You probably, support more spending on social services, probably support, abortion rights. And I would go down the list. And what we have here, which is, what you guys have found and are bringing to us, and what I hear all the time in the field is voters are not automatons. They're not, just, singular. This is not AI, where shocker to find out people are humans and, have varied reasons for making decisions. Did you ever, when you were working on this strategy, what were some tactics that you tossed aside? What were some things where you're like, nah, this just doesn't move the needle?
Yeah, I think we do focus groups every week with all sorts of voters. We really focus on these center-right swing voters. And the thing that we've learned is that we want to be reflecting back the things we're hearing in these swing voter groups with their messaging, right? One of the reasons why the testimonials are also so effective is because we're doing focus groups with these center-right swing voters who are not going to vote for Donald Trump in 2024, don't think they want to vote for Donald Trump in 2024. And what are the reasons why they tell us they don't want to vote for Trump in 2024? January 6th, the election lies. They're worried about what a second Trump administration would look like. They're worried about who would be in a second Trump administration, the kind of yes men that would let Donald Trump get away with breaking the law. And so when we get our testimonials back, we're getting testimonials back from our target audience in a lot of ways, right? So we know what is moving the needle with voters, and we're finding messengers that feel the same way, can speak to those same messages, right? And so we're really mobilizing voters across the country who feel this way, instead of focusing on, hey, let's try out a bunch of different produced advertisements that we think could move the needle and test them out and see if they're going to land with their target audience. We know the center right swing voter who doesn't want to vote for Donald Trump in our bones. We hear from them every week in research. We get our testimonials from them every single day. We know these people better than anybody. And so we kind of know what is going to be needed to move the needle with those folks, instead of just trying to, cut up a bunch of flashy 30s and see what sticks and see what doesn't, right? Like Gunnar said, the messenger is the key to all of this. And that's why we continue to lean into that time and time again.
Yet we are deeply much more concerned about persuading the average voter in the swing state than going viral on Twitter. And I think that practically, when you look at what a flashy political ad is, and I mean, here's the thing. In the swing states, you have a bunch of Senate races, you're going to have competitive House races, and then you have the presidential, right? And I think that voters are accustomed to hearing the voiceover, right? Whether it be male or female, but they have the tone of these political ads in their head, and I think it can kind of wash over them. And I think that these voters are struck by a very unproduced testimonial of a voter talking to them. That I think that there's a practical nature to our strategy that very much benefits us in trying to persuade these voters.
Yeah, I remember I was up in New Hampshire for the primary a couple months ago, and I was at one of these Trump Get Out the Vote efforts, a volunteer effort at their Manchester headquarters. And it was fascinating to me. I was talking with an older gentleman in there who's, hardcore for Trump. Obviously he's phone banking in there for him. And we were talking, I mentioned, I wrote a book about Mike Pence, and he's like, oh, I love Mike Pence. I'm like, you do? Like, what are you doing here? He's like, there's the layers to this, and you never know where, what's going to tip somebody. Let's see. I think this is a good chance to hear some more of the testimonials. We've got some clips of their reasoning. Let's hear from some of their reasoning here.
It seems to me that he feels that he should have complete power to do whatever he wants and to minimize the power of the other branches of government, which in my view is very dangerous. The United States was founded with freedoms and rights and privileges that belong to all people, regardless of their religion, regardless of their point of view. And I just don't see Donald Trump willing to respect those other points of view. And to me, that's a very fundamental part of who we are as a country. It has become very clear to me that I just cannot, in good conscience, cast a vote for Donald Trump.
Trump should have accepted the results of the election, whether he disagreed with them or not. Donald Trump was responsible for the violence that occurred on January 6th. He could have controlled what went on, but rather than doing that, he went ahead and tried to incite further violence. I'm not surprised that Donald Trump has all the legal problems that he has, because he's someone who simply can't help himself. What scares me the most about a second Donald Trump term is that we're basically heading in the direction of a dictatorship. So with respect to the upcoming 2024 elections, my intention is to vote basically anyone but Donald Trump. If I have to, I'll vote for Joe Biden.
The retribution stuff is totally the office of the President of the United States is about. It is not a personal office. It is a government office. It is the highest government office. It is used to represent the interests of every American citizen and not carrying out personal vendettas or protecting any single American's ego. It's all narcissism, and that's not a plank for any policy or any platform.
Wow. Yeah. After 8
Tom,
years.
I think one of the things that sticks for me in watching these videos, right, is we talk about the type of voter that makes these testimonials and the type of voter we persuade. We have a term for it. It's the Reagan hangover Republican, right? These are voters who understand and grew up in the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan. And you hear in all those clips, right, the concern about Donald Trump's character, the concern about how he would not live up to the standards of the office, the concerns about our democracy and our country, right? And, you know, these voters understand how important it is for the president to be of a high moral character, how important it is for a president to defend democracy at home and abroad, right? And so every voter has a different journey when it comes to breaking with Donald Trump. But again, sometimes we overthink what the messages should be. And we hear in these videos that these people are just repelled by the idea of Donald Trump being our president again, because he's a bad person who wants to, you know, run for himself and not for the country. And so, you know, that's why these testimonials work so well, because they're speaking at the human level sometimes of what is going on when these voters are thinking about the upcoming presidential race.
And I think that's an important aspect too, when you watch these testimonials, is that we are also going on a voter education campaign, right? That we use our messengers. We think our messenger strategy is very strong, but not every single swing voter is locked into this idea that Trump has put out a true social post about terminating the Constitution or being a dictator on day one. So when they hear from these messengers, who we have found to be most persuasive, they can also convey new information. And another thing that we have found is that when you are in a position where you can convey new information, especially in a presidential race that people say is so baked in, that is the type of message that we are inherently focused on. Because again, it's difficult for me to keep up with every Trump Truth Social post and all the caps lock, going on there. It's difficult for me, and I pay close attention to politics. But for the average everyday voter, they aren't as keyed in on it. And I think that, again, when we talk about messaging versus messenger strategy, that both of those things are incredibly important, even though we believe that the messenger is the thing that's going to persuade voters the most.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here, since, I got a couple of never Trump folks here on the podcast, and we don't have any super diehard MAGA types. Well, number one, let me ask you guys: there's a lot of money to be had in MAGA. Why didn't you go MAGA like so many other Republicans?
Yeah, I'm completely repulsed by Donald Trump and his brand of politics. I think that the moment he went down on the escalator and talked about immigrants, I found it to be absolutely disgusting. But I want to send a message to Republican leaders and even Republican primary voters that the candidate that they have chosen to take over the Republican Party completely it is a losing strategy. We saw it happen in 2018. We saw it happen with Trump in 2020. The election fraud lies are completely ridiculous. And we saw it in 2022 with Trump's back candidates like Carrie Lake and Doug Mastriano. And the thing is that we did focus groups with swing voters last cycle, and they very much wanted to vote for a generic Republican. But when we introduced a candidate like Adam Laxalt or Herschel Walker, they couldn't get behind it. So to the Republicans out there, it's a losing strategy, and it's something that I'd wish that they'd understand, but it's a choice that they have made both at the elite and base level. And John, I'm happy for you to weigh in on this too.
Yeah, I think the elites play an incredibly important role in how the Republican Party has fundamentally changed. This is Donald Trump's party. It's 100% magnified at this point. And when we think back to Jeff Flake leaving the House of Representatives, and we've moved all the way up to Laura Trump being the co-chair of the RNC, it shows how every elite who has tried to speak out against Donald Trump, who's wanted to fight back against Trump, has been exorcised from the Republican Party. And time again, there's been opportunities for Republican elites to say, enough is enough. We're all going to fight back. Right after January 6th, there's House speeches and Senate speeches on the floor in Congress talking about how Donald Trump was responsible for the violence that day. And then weeks later, Kevin McCarthy's back in Mar-a-Lago bending the knee to Donald Trump. This party has time and time again at the elite level caved to the demands of Donald Trump. And this is the party that they've made. And it's total chaos, right? They can't win national elections. They can't govern in Congress, right? They can't keep a speaker, what seems for more than 3 weeks before there's a motion to vacate, right? So this party has blown itself up in the service to Donald Trump. And not only is that a losing strategy, but it's incredibly dangerous for our country. We've already seen the consequences of what Donald Trump's election lies led to on January 6th. This party is getting worse, not better. And it's really important, for elites to speak up. But at the same time, our campaign has always been driven by the real voters who do have the courage, right, to speak out against Donald Trump, saying, I voted for him in the past, I can't do it again. And we know that there's Republican elites, former Trump administration officials, electeds who know how dangerous Donald Trump is, but refuse to speak up, right? And so the courage of the folks that we have, everyday Americans who are part of a $50 million advertising campaign, speaking out against Donald Trump, knowing that their friends are going to see this and they're going to be upset. Their family's going to see this and they're going to be upset. They're doing it anyway because they care about our country more than their political identity. And then we have Republican elites who aren't willing to do the same thing. And so, we elevate these voices because we think they're the most persuasive messengers. It's really important for them to get their messages out. It's very cathartic for them as well. So we're not, the stars of this campaign, those voters are, but it does show as well the Republican elites and the cowardice on behalf of them ever since Donald Trump went down the escalator has led to the situation we're in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I am a Republican. I am a conservative, but the Republican Party at the base and the elite level, they no longer care how conservative you are. If you looked at how many House Republicans voted to impeach after January 6th, there were 10. 8 of them are no longer elected. There's, a congressman like Tom Rice of South Carolina. He had an extremely conservative voting record, but at the end of the day, he couldn't win a Republican primary because he didn't show fealty to Donald Trump, right? That it is about being loyal to Donald Trump. And I don't want to be part of a Republican Party that demands that instead of caring about a conservative agenda that may be better for the country. I mean, take a look at former Vice President Mike Pence, who served as Trump's vice president, who is very conservative, who is refusing to endorse Donald Trump because he understands that Donald Trump's agenda is not about being conservative. It's about serving himself.
Have you guys had any talks with Pence about maybe having him do something for RVAT?
No, we have not, but we have been incredibly encouraged by someone like Nikki Haley, who a lot of our supporters very much enjoy, who look at her as the establishment pick and probably voted for her in the primary, even if she had already suspended her campaign. But we are encouraged by these elite Republicans speaking out against supporting Trump. But as John alluded to, we'd like to see a lot more of it because we know there are so many adults in the room who know better, who have yet to speak out.
Let me let me go back and play devil's advocate here. I'll do my best Steve Bannon impersonation. I'll sweep my hair a little bit and pop
I don't
$5.
think you're wearing enough collars.
Yeah, I'd say it's cold down here. Come on. I mean, what do you say to the Bannon types? The people who say, we kicked out the globalists, we kicked out the Illuminati. This is a populist party now. The Bushes are the family that led us into the Iraq war. We're anti-war. We believe in strong borders. We believe in, actual enforcement of immigration. What do you say to that? Because, that is a majority of the Republican Party now.
It is absolutely a majority of the Republican Party. But the thing that I would say to Steve Bannon and his types is enjoy this continued loss of elections, right? That if there's one thing that we know, that the white, college-educated suburban voter is the margin maker at this point in time. And they cannot stand this version of the Republican Party. These are McCain Republicans. And you have people like Carrie Lake, who did it last cycle, saying, I don't want John McCain's vote. Well, guess what that got you? Katie Hobbs being elected in Arizona. Swing voter, we could not, in all the focus groups we did in Pennsylvania last cycle, we couldn't find a single one among the swing voters who wanted to vote for Doug Mastriano. Some of them were actually making an affirmative case for now Governor Josh Shapiro. So I think that it's a losing strategy. And while you may have taken over the media infotainment space, have taken over a majority of the Republican Party electorally, it is a losing strategy time and time again.
Yeah, Gunnar referenced this earlier, right? The target audience that we're going after, these center-right swing voters that we can persuade not to vote for Donald Trump in 2024, they're not large in size, but they're large in influence, right? You're looking at Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, the three blue wall states that present the best path to victory for Joe Biden in 2024. These states are going to be decided by tens of thousands of votes, by half of a percentage point. So on the margins, right, the people who make up the winning margins for Joe Biden in 2020 and in 2024 are going to be these Republicans who are repelled by Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party. So we don't have to persuade every single Republican to vote against Donald Trump in 2024. We need to persuade, the number we kick around is about 30%. So 30% makes up the center-right voters who voted for Nikki Haley in the early primary states, where she was able to mobilize support against Donald Trump. It represents the number of Republicans who would not vote for Donald Trump if he was convicted of a crime. And it represents about the number of Republicans who would not, or who believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate president, right? So these are people who voted against Donald Trump in a primary, would not vote for him if he committed a crime, and aren't with him on the 2020 election lies, right? So of that, about 30%, half of them probably already voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Those are the voters we mobilized in that campaign, right? And then there's another 15%. Some of them, of course, are going to come home to Donald Trump. But if you're splitting that 15% in half and you're getting them to vote against Donald Trump in 2024 after voting for him in 2020, not only are we reanimating the anti-Trump coalition that won in 2020, but we're expanding it even greater, right? And this is a rematch of the 2020 election. Biden needs to expand his margins. The anti-Trump coalition needs to get a little bit bigger because, naturally there's going to be some backsliding with some voting groups, right? It's not going to be a perfect rematch where everybody comes out and votes for the same guy again. But we ran this race before. We know that Biden has a winning coalition. We know the anti-Trump coalition is strong enough to defeat Donald Trump. We just have to make it a little bit bigger. We have to reanimate it. We have to remobilize it, right? So we don't have to be finding the folks who are listening to the War Room podcast with Steve Bannon and try to get them to vote for Joe Biden, right? Those people are never going to vote against Donald Trump. But on the margins, we can make incredible momentum and movement in 2024 with these center-right voters who are on the fence right now.
Tom, in Arizona, when the primary was effectively dead, more than 100,000 Republican primary voters went for Nikki Haley. This was a state that was decided in 2020, the presidential, and 22 in the gubernatorial race by about 10,000, 11,000 votes, right? And there were more than 100,000 willing to go out there and vote essentially as a protest vote against Donald Trump. These voters exist, right? They live outside of Phoenix, outside of Tucson, in a place like Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg. They exist in all of the swing states, and that's the type of voter. And again, just to reiterate, it does not represent a majority of the Republican Party, but it represents a significant segment within the electorate that look at what Donald Trump has done to the Republican Party and can no longer support it.
It reminds me a lot of, we in the press, we have long spent so much time paying attention to, for lack of a better term, the clowns, Marjorie Taylor Greene's floating white balloons during the State of the Union, that weird guy that had a bow tie and the Trump arrest mugshot, the member of Congress. I don't remember which one, because when you're a member of Congress, you probably need to put on a suit. That goes for Fetterman and that other guy. And sorry to both of them if that's not properly respectful. I don't care. Respect the office. But it reminds me that, we spend so much time paying attention to the quote unquote hard right Freedom Caucus, House Freedom Caucus, whose, numbers go somewhere between 20, 30, 40 members at any given time. And I remember when McCarthy was really struggling at the beginning of 23 to secure the speakership as a numbers game. I mean, as somebody who used to cover state houses for about a decade, just a sheer numbers game. And again, this goes to the voting dynamic here. You should be spending as much, if not more, attention to your moderate Republicans, because that's an equal counterweight. And what happens if they decide to either, go with the Democrats, e.g. on something like Ukraine aid, something which used to be almost unanimous, have almost unanimous support, or decide to abstain from a vote, decide to sit it out, thereby lowering your benchmark there. And I feel like, we haven't paid enough attention to the flip side of that coin, which, again, as pluralities go. There's that great piece that Nate Cohn wrote over the New York Times last summer about the 6 different factions of the Republican Party. And I think he really nailed it. I think it's like the old establishment still makes up about 14%. People like Susan Collins, Northeast Republicans. That's a lot. When you're playing at the margins like this, we're going to write about Jill Stein, and not Jill Stein anymore, Cornel West, RFK Jr. Let me ask you guys something. This is really fascinating. I had a number of Trump sources tell me this about RFK a while ago, that it was stupid to be supporting RFK from inside Trump world. They thought it was friggin' terrible. I'm trying not to curse here, even though we are on a podcast and there are no FCC rules here. They said it was terrible. And now we're seeing this polling. The Marist came out recently, about a week or two ago, showing that RFK is eating into Trump's base of MAGA people, not the other way around, as we previously thought, or seemed to be. Have you seen this in your polling, in your focus groups? Do you have a sense of this? Why this is happening?
Yeah, I think RFK has a lot of political advantages right now as far as third party candidates go. He's got the high name ID, obviously, for being a Kennedy. And so we've done groups with both, Democrats and Republicans. We asked them about RFK in every single group. And what we see is that for the Trump skeptical voters, RFK can be a draw a lot of times because of his stance on the vaccine, right? So his anti-vax conspiracy theories can kind of pull from voters on the right. And then on the left, when voters are not very enthusiastic about Joe Biden being on the top of the ticket, they see RFK as a Kennedy. They see him as somebody who's both a Kennedy who has a political lineage, but also an outsider at the same time, because he's not, obviously they know a little bit about his family dynamic, right? So they see him as kind of an outsider coming into the political scene. They see him as an environmental lawyer who's done a lot of good work on the environmental side of things, right? So for Kennedy right now, he's a bit of a Rorschach test, depending on if you're a Democratic voter who's doesn't have a lot of enthusiasm for Biden, or a Republican voter who doesn't have a lot of enthusiasm for Trump, he can kind of pull from both because he's not well defined at this point. We think ultimately him being on the ballot is not something we want. We'd rather fight this thing head to head, make it a binary choice between two candidates, because anything that's going to break up the anti-Trump coalition is a negative, right? We want it to be as big and as powerful as possible. But ultimately, as groups start to define Kennedy as a conspiracy theorist, as a lunatic, frankly, as somebody who doesn't believe in the vaccine, that could alienate more Democratic skeptical voters than Republicans. So ultimately, it looks like he could very well pull more from Trump. But at the same time, you got to really question, if you want to be running this race, trying to triple bank shot a third party candidate that's going to pull from Trump and keep the coalition together in Wisconsin, that's going to be decided by 10,000 votes. Do you really want that variable there? Probably not, right?
Yeah, Tom, I mean, there was a Fox News polling that came out last week, and in 2 of the states it helped Trump with Kennedy on the ballot, and 2 of the states it helped Biden on the ballot. I think it's very much up in the air, but I will say, just to add on to what John was talking about, is this development of no labels not being on the ticket was huge for our campaign, right? That the more moderate, maybe a Democrat and Republican, who these traditional Republicans, suburban college educated voters who had decided the election, that would have given them a very easy off ramp not to vote for Joe Biden. So the way that we evaluate things, the no labels threat was much more dangerous than a Kennedy ticket. And I think that plenty of defining of Kennedy is going to help out Democrats more than Republicans at this point.
Okay. So we've got another clip that you guys put together. It's one of your most recent ads. Admittedly, pretty snarky. This is not direct voter testimonial. This is, if you're charged with a crime or 88 crimes down from 91, can you get a job at the mall? Let's see this one. I got a laugh out of this one.
I was wondering if you guys are hiring right now. I was thinking about applying for a job. I was thinking about applying for a job here. I'm currently facing 88 felonies. For detention of classified information. If you all take people that have been found liable for sexual assault, trying to overturn the 2020 election, falsifying business records, I was wondering if that was going to be a problem.
I think working with diamonds and jewelry, they're going to do a background check.
Yeah.
So that's the only.
So probably not.
Yeah.
So do you guys hire people that have been found liable for sexual assault, or?
No, we run a full background.
Okay.
No, we don't. I don't think so.
Okay.
Donald Trump has been charged with 88 felonies and found liable for sexual assault. If Trump is too big of a liability to get a job at your local mall, he is too big of a liability to be president of the United States. Republican Accountability PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So,
Tom, you can see it's snarky. I understand that point, but again, what our job is through our campaign, Republican Voters Against Trump, is to constantly be educating voters, right? That we ran this nationally on Fox and Friends as well as Morning Joe, but we ran it digitally in the blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And what does this ad do, right? It conveys that there are 88 felonies for indictments against Donald Trump. And the thing that we've also noticed in our focus groups with maybe some of the more lower information voters, right? These are everyday people who are worried about kitchen table issues, is that all of these cases, all of Trump's legal baggage and drama, it can kind of blend together for these voters. So what an ad like this allows for us to do is educate them, right? That hit on the specifics. And at the same exact time, this New York case is coming into fruition, right? That Trump is in the courtroom, their local news is covering it. This was a perfect opportunity to seize the moment and go on a voter education campaign. And yeah, sure, it's attention grabbing, but we've also found that this is perfectly in line with what our North Star is of constantly educating and reminding voters of what Donald Trump represents, what he is, what a second Trump administration would look like with all the legal baggage and drama that surrounds Donald Trump that may play with the base, but swing voters certainly don't want a felon as president.
Nice. All right. Well, Gunnar and John, guys, thank you so much for joining us here on the 24 Site podcast. The work you've been doing is really illuminating, and I love listening to these voter testimonials. It reminds me of when I'm out in the field talking with folks, and I think it's really helpful. Where can we find your work? What's the best place to look for Republican voters against Trump?
Yeah, I encourage anybody to go to rvat.org, and watch these testimonials. As John said earlier, and he's totally right, we are not the story here. The story is all about these average, everyday, politically homeless voters willing to step out, put their neck out a little bit and say, you know what, I may have been a Republican my whole life, but I can't get behind Donald Trump. And I think that watching them tell their stories is incredibly humbling and courageous, and I encourage anybody to watch them.
Very cool. Guys, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. All right, guys, our very first 24 Site video pod. Look for more 24site.news. Cheers.